The sun beat down on the dry plains like a hammer, casting long, hard shadows across the ranch that had been in her family for generations. The wind carried the faint smell of sagebrush and dust, twisting through the wooden fences and over the parched earth, whispering warnings only she seemed to hear. She stood near the edge of the corral, hands clenched at her sides, listening to the heavy footsteps of the man who had ridden up without a word, his hat tipped low over eyes that held both challenge and expectation. The cowboy's voice cut through the still air, firm and unyielding. "Marry me or your father loses the land," he said, every word deliberate, every pause loaded with pressure that left no room for argument. Her jaw tightened as her mind raced. The ranch wasn't just property, it was her family's legacy, a testament to generations of sweat, blood, and stubborn survival in a land that didn't forgive weakness. Yet the man in front of her, dressed in worn leather and riding boots caked with dust, made it clear that her choice wasn't a suggestion. It was an ultimatum. Across the horizon, the mountains shimmered under the afternoon sun, their jagged peaks like the edges of her own turmoil. She knew the stakes. Her father had gambled on this deal, trusting promises made with a shake of a hand and the glare of a determined man who didn't hesitate to make others bend to his will. She remembered the first time she had seen him ride across the open plains. The sound of hooves had been like a drumbeat, steady and relentless, echoing through the canyons and stirring a restless energy in everyone who saw him pass. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, a cowboy with more reputation than patience. Stories of his cunning, his sharp instincts, and the iron will to claim any victory had floated across the county long before she ever laid eyes on him. And now, here he was, demanding her hand as if it were a prize to be won, his horse pawing the ground in quiet impatience. Her heart twisted in conflict. She had grown up on this land, knowing the rhythm of its seasons and the secrets of the river that ran through the valley. Every corner of the ranch held a memory of her childhood, the nights her father taught her to track deer, the mornings spent learning which herbs could heal a wound, the laughter that echoed across the fields when her family gathered for a meal under the fading light. And yet, standing there, she felt those memories threatened, like the wind might snatch them away if she didn't act. The cowboy didn't move closer, but the weight of his presence was enough to make the ground seem heavier under her boots. "I'm not asking for much," he said, the edge in his tone softening just enough to remind her that this was still a deal. "One signature, one promise, and your father keeps everything he's worked for. Refuse and it all goes." He leaned back slightly in his saddle, watching her, calculating. Every second stretched, thick and heavy, the air between them charged with tension. She thought of her father, his hands calloused from years of labor, his eyes tired but proud, trusting her to make the right decision. The thought of him losing everything pierced her resolve, but anger flared as well. How dare this man, a stranger who rode into their lives like a storm, make such a choice for her? The land wasn't just dirt and grass, it was home, sanctuary, and inheritance all rolled into one. And she, a young woman raised with pride and a sense of justice, would not be coerced into a life she hadn't chosen. "Do you really think a piece of paper or a promise changes who I am?" she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She met his gaze head-on, refusing to give in to the intimidation in his posture, the authority in his tone. "You think I'll trade my freedom for what you claim is honor?" The cowboy shifted in his saddle, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. "Freedom doesn't keep your father alive? Doesn't protect what's his? This isn't about you. This is about survival, about keeping blood and sweat from being wasted. If you think I'm bluffing, take a look at the men waiting at the county office. The deeds are ready, the law's signed. All it takes is your agreement." She swallowed hard, feeling the knot in her chest tighten. The law, the signatures, the official papers, all lined against her. And yet she refused to be just another pawn in a man's game of power. Her heritage as an Apache Heiress had taught her resilience, a respect for her ancestors' strength, and the courage to face impossible choices without surrendering. But now the choice wasn't between courage and cowardice, it was between love of land and love of self, and she wasn't sure if either would leave her unbroken. Her mind flashed to the river, to the cool waters that had carried her through storms, to the nights she had danced under the stars with her sister by her side. Those moments were fleeting, but they were hers. Could she let them be overshadowed by this cowboy's demand, by this harsh line drawn across the horizon of her life? She wanted to say no, to defy him outright, but her father's face lined with worry and quiet despair made her hesitate. She felt the tug of loyalty against the pull of independence, each heartbeat a drum summoning both fear and courage. The cowboy's voice broke into her thoughts again. You hesitate because you know what's right. You know your family depends on this. Don't let pride cost them everything. There was a sharp edge in his tone now, a hint of impatience that reminded her he wasn't accustomed to waiting. He nudged the horse forward, not threatening, but asserting presence, a silent reminder of the urgency pressing against her. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the dust-filled air and steadying herself. There were whispers of advice she had heard from the elders' words about strength, survival, and keeping one's heart intact even when the world demanded compromise. She had to make a choice, but her instincts screamed that any decision made in haste could haunt her forever. She opened her eyes to meet the cowboy again, and in that instant the wind picked up, rustling the dry grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and smoke from distant campfires. A shadow moved at the edge of the property line, a lone figure appearing on the horizon. She squinted, unsure if her imagination played tricks on her or if someone was approaching. The cowboy noticed it too, his head tilting slightly as if he sensed the presence before her. The tension thickened, turning the quiet plains into a stage for unspoken challenges, waiting for the moment when the first move would be made. The approaching figure might change everything, or it might be a distraction, a test of will and patience. The air grew heavier as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson. She felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders, the gravity of the ultimatum settling deep in her chest. Every instinct screamed to run, to fight, to preserve the land and her dignity, yet the law, the deeds, and the promise to her father tethered her to the place where she stood. She could not walk away, not without consequences that would ripple through the valley and into the hearts of everyone she loved. For a moment neither spoke. The cowboy's eyes, sharp and unyielding, held hers, reading the unspoken thoughts swirling behind them. She could almost hear the heartbeat of the land itself, pulsing under her boots, demanding loyalty and resilience. Her fingers itched to reach for the papers, to make a choice, to end the waiting agony. But something in the distance held her attention, a flicker of movement that hinted at more than mere coincidence. The cowboy's jaw tightened, and he nudged the horse again, a quiet reminder that time was slipping, that the opportunity to act was fleeting. She lifted her chin, her gaze hardening, and felt the spark of defiance flare inside her. She would not be dictated to, not completely. Not yet. The land was her heritage, the blood of generations coursed through it, and she would honor it, but at what cost? A sudden clatter from the far edge of the ranch snapped her attention. Horses neighed, and the wind carried the sound of hurried footsteps. She realized then that the decision might not wait for her contemplation. The cowboy's eyes followed hers, narrowing as a tense silence fell over the land, broken only by the distant noise approaching fast enough to demand action. Every muscle in her body tensed, every thought sharpened to a razor's edge. The sun's last light glinted off the cowboy's spurs, and she saw in that glint the promise of power, of insistence, of a challenge she could not ignore. Her choice was no longer just hers, it had become a stage for forces she couldn't fully measure, a test not just of heart but of courage and survival. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust, sweat, and anticipation, and she realized that whatever path she chose, nothing would be simple. The cowboy's voice finally broke the moment, quiet yet commanding. "Decide," he said. "Because soon, the land, your father, and everything you hold dear will depend on it." Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes held fire. She understood that the next words she spoke could bind or break generations. She took a deep breath, knowing that no matter what she chose, the plains, the mountains, and the river would remember. And somewhere in the shadow of the approaching figure, the truth of her decision waited, ready to unfold in ways that none could predict. She stepped forward, lifting her chin against the weight of the ultimatum, her voice caught between defiance and duty, ready to respond. But before she could speak, the distant figure drew closer, and the tension that had coiled across the ranch snapped like a drawn bowstring, leaving her frozen, the cowboy tense, and the fate of the land hanging in the balance. Choices would be made, promises tested, and lives forever changed. The sun slipped below the horizon, and darkness crept over the plains, carrying with it the uncertainty of what her answer might bring. She glanced once more at the approaching figure, then at the cowboy who had thrown down this challenge. And in that heartbeat she knew that nothing in her world would ever be the same. The wind rose again, carrying whispers of the land's judgment, and in the quiet tension of the twilight she prepared herself. One word, one motion, could decide the future, but which path would she take? The ranch, her father, and her own heart waited for her answer as shadows lengthened across the dry, waiting plains. Her lips parted, ready to speak, and the story of choice, loyalty, and survival hung suspended, waiting for the moment she would finally decide. The approaching figure emerged more clearly as the shadows stretched across the plains, a solitary rider kicking up dust that caught the fading light. Her heart thudded against her ribs, each beat reminding her of the weight of her choice. She knew that figure could change everything or nothing at all, but the uncertainty alone was enough to make the air heavy and her hands shake slightly. She shifted her stance, gripping the hem of her dress, and stole a glance at the cowboy. He remained rigid, his eyes narrowing, reading her hesitation like a man who had spent years learning the language of fear and pride. The rider was unmistakable now, though distant enough that her mind spun with possibilities. Could it be a friend? A messenger? Or someone who would tip the scales in a way she could not predict? The wind tugged at her hair, brushing across her face, carrying scents of horse, leather, and smoke that seemed to seep from the horizon itself. She remembered how her father had always said the land had ears, and for the first time she felt the truth of that wisdom. Every blade of grass, every fence post seemed to hold witness to the moment, waiting to see what she would do. Her thoughts wandered briefly to her family, to the life she had known before this ultimatum had been thrust upon her. Her father had worked tirelessly, rising before dawn each day, guiding her hands as she learned the tasks of the ranch. Her mother had passed when she was young, leaving a quiet echo of tenderness and discipline that had shaped her into the woman who now faced impossible pressure. Each memory was sharp and clear, like splinters beneath her skin, reminding her that the stakes were far more than legal papers and land deeds. They were blood, history, and pride. The cowboy shifted again, the horse's hooves crunching against the gravel, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the ranch. He leaned slightly forward, speaking low, almost conversational, but every word carried the weight of inevitability. "You know why I'm here," he said. "No tricks, no waiting. Either you decide for the land, for your family, or you risk losing everything. That's the truth you're facing." His tone was calm, almost friendly, but beneath it lay the steel edge that warned of consequences if she defied him. She opened her mouth to speak, but the wind carried the sound of hooves from the other rider, drawing her attention back to the newcomer. The figure moved closer now, the outline of a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat visible even against the deepening twilight. The rider's approach was deliberate, steady, as if time itself slowed in respect for the tension hanging over the plains. Her stomach tightened. Whoever this was, they were not here by accident. Something had drawn them to this place at this exact hour, and that thought made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She thought of the stories her father had told her about the Apache ancestors, the way they had fought for every inch of land, for every drop of water, for the right to remain free. They had known threats, deceit, and outsiders who sought to bend them to their will, and yet they had always chosen honor and cunning over blind submission. She drew on that strength now, feeling the pulse of generations in her chest, the courage that had kept her people alive. But courage alone would not solve the problem set before her. This was not a battle of swords and arrows. It was a battle of wills, law, and survival. The cowboy's hand hovered near his holster, a subtle reminder that he was armed, that his patience was not endless. "Don't waste time," he said quietly, though his voice carried across the open fields. "Decisions are for those willing to take responsibility. Hesitation can cost more than pride ever will." Her eyes narrowed as she considered her options. To yield would mean securing her father's land, but at the price of her own freedom and future. To refuse would be to challenge a man who had never been denied what he wanted and to risk everything her family had worked for. Her mind raced through every scenario, every potential consequence. She thought of the cattle, the fields, the barns, every corner of the property, each one a tangible reminder of what could be lost. Yet she also considered herself, the woman who had grown strong, independent, and unafraid. A distant rider reached the corral and slowed, the horse kicking up a small cloud of dust as they dismounted. The figure moved with quiet confidence, boots crunching over gravel, hand resting lightly on the brim of the hat. She could not yet see the face, only the silhouette framed by the fiery streaks of sunset. Something about the presence felt familiar and dangerous at the same time. Her pulse quickened and she realized that this was no ordinary messenger. This was someone who could tip the balance, someone whose intentions she could not yet guess. The cowboy's gaze followed hers, sharp and calculating. He did not speak, but she felt the subtle shift in his posture, the way his body tensed as if preparing for any interference. He knew, as well as she did, that this moment carried more weight than any papers could convey. It was not merely a negotiation. It was a crucible, a test of character, courage, and will. Her thoughts drifted to the Apache legends her father had shared, stories of tricksters, warriors, and those who walked the line between life and death, choosing their path with a mixture of bravery and cunning. She felt the old teachings resonate now, the sense that choices were never easy, that true strength was measured by the ability to act in the face of impossible odds. Her hand brushed against the locket at her neck, a small talisman from her mother, and she drew strength from its presence. It was a reminder that she carried the past with her, that she was not alone even as the future pressed against her chest. The newcomer moved closer, and she could finally make out a glimpse of the face beneath the shadow of the hat. A rugged face, sun-beaten and lined, but with eyes that carried knowledge and intent. The stranger's gaze flicked to the cowboy and then back to her, a silent assessment, as if weighing the situation and the potential for action. She felt a shiver run down her spine. This was no ordinary visitor. This was someone who understood stakes, danger, and leverage. The cowboy spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "I don't know who that is, and I don't care. The choice is still yours. But don't think another person changes the weight of the decision." He leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on her, studying her reaction. "This is about survival, about keeping what your family has earned. That's all there is to it." She swallowed hard, the words of both men pressing on her from different angles, each demanding a response she did not feel ready to give. Her instincts told her to run, to retreat, to delay the decision until she understood the newcomer's purpose. But her heart and her heritage would not allow her to abandon the land or her family. The tension stretched across the plains, a web of threats, loyalty, and uncertainty that seemed to tighten with every passing second. The rider paused a few feet from the corral, shifting the weight of the coat, the hat dipping slightly as if in acknowledgement of the weight of the moment. She caught a glimpse of a faint smile, though it was nothing warm, nothing inviting. It was the smile of someone who knew more than they let on, someone whose arrival was no accident and whose purpose might change everything. Her father had often warned her that the land attracted more than cowboys and lawmen. It drew attention from those who sought advantage, from those who could strike when least expected. And now, as the wind shifted and the dust swirled between them, she realized the truth of his warnings. Her choice was no longer merely about a man's ultimatum. It was about navigating a web of forces, each with its own stake, each with its own power to alter her life. The cowboy's hand moved briefly, brushing against the reins, a silent signal that he was ready for whatever might come. The rider stepped closer, boots crunching against the gravel, and for the first time, she sensed the faintest edge of anticipation in the stranger's posture. There was no rush, yet every movement suggested a readiness to act if provoked. She felt the weight of the locket against her chest, a reminder of promises made, of her mother's lessons, and the strength of her own lineage. The plains stretched around them, silent witnesses to a confrontation that had not yet fully formed, but was already poised to erupt. Every shadow, every flicker of movement seemed loaded with meaning. Time slowed as the sun vanished completely behind the distant hills. leaving a twilight haze that softened the edges of the ranch and drew the focus to the three figures standing on the corral's edge: herself, the cowboy, and the mysterious rider. She could feel the gravity of the moment, the inevitability of choices yet to be made. Nothing was certain, and yet everything demanded action. Her fingers tightened around the hem of her dress, and she drew a steadying breath. The decision before her was no longer simple. It was not just a question of land or family, of compliance or defiance. It was a test of judgment, courage, and wisdom. And even as she prepared to speak, to act, to choose, she knew the outcome might not follow any path she could foresee. The wind picked up again, rustling the dry grass, and she realized that the plains themselves held their breath, waiting to see how the next move would unfold. The cowboy remained tense, his gaze locked on hers, while the stranger shifted slightly, observing with quiet intensity. The land, her family, and the future hung suspended in the twilight. She opened her mouth, ready to voice her choice, but the words caught in her throat as the stranger finally tipped the hat back, revealing eyes that seemed to pierce the gathering dusk. The intensity of that gaze held a silent promise, a warning, and a question all at once. She knew in that instant that the moment was far from over. Decisions would come, loyalties would be tested, and the land she loved might demand more than she had ever been prepared to give. Her chest tightened with a mixture of fear and resolve. Every instinct, every lesson, every memory surged to the forefront. She could not turn away, and yet the answer remained elusive. One choice could save her family or bind her spirit. Another could defy the cowboy, risk everything, or unleash consequences she had not imagined. The plains lay quiet, the sun gone, leaving a twilight suffused with tension. She took a step forward, but the weight of the ultimatum, the presence of the stranger, and the responsibility for her father's legacy pressed down harder than ever. The cowboy's voice cut softly through the air, almost lost to the wind. "Decide," he said again. And she realized that no answer, no matter how carefully measured, could undo the tension that had already settled across the land. She stood between choice and consequence, between loyalty and self-preservation, with two figures whose presence alone demanded her attention and every ounce of her courage. The night crept in, shadows stretching longer across the plains, and in that stillness she understood that the moment had only begun. The land, the cowboy, the stranger, and her own heart would test her, each in ways she could not yet imagine. The first words of her decision hovered on her lips, waiting to be spoken, while the wind whispered through the grass, carrying promises of challenge, danger, and the unknown that lay ahead. The night settled, and the story of choice, survival, and loyalty waited, poised on the edge of action, with the next move still unknown and every heart holding its breath. The night pressed down over the plains, the darkness thick and almost alive, wrapping the ranch in a heavy silence that made every creak of wood and shift of horse hooves sound like a warning. She stood frozen, the locket at her chest pressing against her thoughts. The cowboy's gaze fixed, unwavering, and the stranger's eyes glinting faintly in the low light, unreadable and sharp. The wind carried the smell of dust and faint smoke from distant campfires, mingling with the scent of horses and leather, the smells of survival and stubbornness that had marked this land for generations. The cowboy's patience was taut, every muscle coiled like a spring. He had not expected this kind of hesitation, though he had seen it before. Some women could be swayed with charm, others with threats, and a rare few with both. But she was neither pliable nor easily intimidated. She had the fire of her ancestors in her, the kind of resolve that had kept families alive through droughts, raids, and hardship. He knew he could not force her hand without risking more than the land. He could lose control of the situation entirely. The stranger stepped closer, boots crunching softly against the gravel, and she realized with sudden clarity that he was not here to negotiate or deliver a message. He was here to watch, to observe the tension, to see the interplay of wills, and perhaps to tilt the balance when it suited him. She felt the weight of his gaze, the quiet pressure of an unknown authority, and it unnerved her more than the cowboy's overt demand. He carried the calm of someone accustomed to measuring risk, someone who had spent years understanding human hesitation and advantage. Her father had always warned her that outsiders brought with them more than intentions. They brought consequences that could not always be foreseen. She remembered nights sitting by the fire as he spoke in low tones about treaties, debts, and promises made with hands and words that often carried hidden meanings. The land had been preserved not by luck, but by vigilance, by understanding who could be trusted and who could not. And now, standing between these two men, she understood the full weight of his lessons. The cowboy shifted slightly in his saddle as she noticed the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of long days under the sun, decisions made on the edge of danger, and the unspoken code he lived by. He was a man who believed in results, not reasoning. The threat was simple: comply, and your father keeps the land. Refuse, and he loses it. But she also saw the fine cracks beneath that certainty, the tension of someone who knew the stakes could spiral into something uncontrollable. Her thoughts drifted to the mysterious stranger again. She couldn't yet place him, but something in his posture and quiet confidence told her he had knowledge she did not. Perhaps he had seen similar confrontations before, or maybe he had dealings with men like the cowboy who thought power could be taken through threats alone. She sensed that he might intervene, subtly, in ways that could save her father or complicate everything beyond recognition. She felt the pull of uncertainty tighten like a noose. She stepped slightly forward, testing the space between herself and the cowboy, trying to measure his reaction. He did not flinch, did not lower his gaze. It was as though he had measured every heartbeat, every second of hesitation, and counted it against her resolve. His voice broke the silence again, low and deliberate. "You know what this means," he said. "A simple answer could save more than just land. It could save a lifetime of struggle for your family. Hesitation is expensive." Her jaw tightened as she forced herself to look past him, to the horizon where the stranger now stood, the outlines of his face sharper, the wind tugging at his coat. She wondered what thoughts ran through his mind. Was he assessing the cowboy? Watching her? Or waiting for the exact moment to make a move that could change the outcome entirely? She felt the tension pull at her from both sides, a constant pressure she could not ignore, a trap woven from words, law, and the weight of legacy. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her memory, the lessons of caution and courage intertwined. He had taught her that land was more than soil, it was identity, responsibility, and memory. To lose it was to lose a part of oneself. And yet he had also taught her that no amount of loyalty or obligation should erase self-respect or blind her to danger. That lesson had never been tested like this, not with two men waiting, measuring her every move, and the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. The cowboy nudged his horse, a subtle reminder that patience had limits. She noticed his hand, strong and capable, resting near the holster, a promise that force was always close at hand. It wasn't an empty threat, it was a reality. He was a man who acted decisively, who calculated risks and delivered consequences without hesitation. And yet, she could see the faint flicker of something else in patience, perhaps even respect for her defiance, or maybe frustration that the outcome was not already certain. The stranger shifted as well, pulling slightly on the brim of his hat, a gesture of acknowledgement or perhaps strategy. She could feel the tension between the two men, an invisible line drawn across the ranch that held her in its center. Each man represented different pressures, one overt, immediate, and demanding. The other subtle, calculating, and potentially transformative. Her instincts told her to watch, to wait, to measure every breath before acting. Every step, every word, every glance carried consequence she could not yet fully grasp. She thought of the land again, the open fields, the river curving through the valley, the barns, the fences, and the cattle grazing silently in the shadowed twilight. Everything she loved was under pressure, and everything she feared losing seemed poised just beyond her control. She felt the pull of loyalty, the weight of duty, and the spark of independence all colliding in a way that left her breathless and alert. The cowboy spoke again, his tone softening, almost conversational, but every word still edged with authority. "I've dealt with hesitation before," he said. "I know how it feels to weigh family against pride. But the land doesn't wait, the law doesn't wait, and neither does opportunity. You have to choose." She swallowed, the dry air catching in her throat, and glanced at the stranger. His eyes were steady, almost unreadable, yet they carried an intensity that suggested he had already considered every possible outcome. He made no move to speak, to intervene, only observed, as if measuring the true measure of her character. That silence was more dangerous than any words. It was the kind of quiet that demanded reflection, demanded courage, demanded choice. Her mind flashed back to the early morning rides with her father, to the lessons of resilience, to the understanding that survival depended on action as much as strategy. She thought of every night spent under stars, learning the contours of the land, understanding the habits of animals and men alike. She realized now that those lessons were preparing her for this precise moment, not merely to obey, not merely to resist, but to navigate the impossible tension between survival, loyalty, and self-respect. The cowboy shifted again, subtly, his eyes never leaving hers. "The longer you wait, the less control you have," he said, the quiet steel of his voice carrying over the plain. "The law is clear, the deeds are signed. Delay doesn't protect you, it endangers everything." She felt a rush of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, loyalty, and defiance, all converging into a tight knot in her chest. She wanted to speak, to refuse, to assert her independence, but her father's face flashed in her mind, lined with worry and silent trust, and she realized that every decision carried consequences far beyond herself. She was caught in a web of forces she had only begun to understand, forces that demanded careful thought, courage, and perhaps even cunning. The stranger finally stepped forward, moving closer to the corral, and she could now see the faint shadow of a badge or insignia on his coat, though the details were unclear in the twilight. His presence radiated authority and experience, a quiet command that seemed to challenge the cowboy in ways that words never could. He stopped just short of the corral, studying the scene with careful attention, and, for the first time, she sensed that his role in this drama was not passive. He could tip the balance, but toward what end, she could not yet discern. The cowboy's hand brushed briefly against the reins, his jaw tightening, but he did not speak. She could feel the tension between them, a silent negotiation, a clash of wills that left her standing at the center. Every instinct screamed to act, but every lesson, every memory, every ounce of caution told her to wait, to measure, to understand before committing to a path. She thought of her mother again, of the wisdom passed down through quiet lessons and stories by the fire. Strength was not merely resistance. It was clarity, foresight, and patience. Courage was not rash action, but measured resolve. And now, standing between two men whose presence alone shaped her fate, she understood that those lessons were more crucial than ever. The wind stirred, lifting dust and loose leaves, carrying the scent of sage and smoke, and she felt the land itself responding to the tension. It was as if the plains held their breath, waiting to see which choice would be made, which word would be spoken, and which loyalty would claim dominance. Every shadow seemed loaded with meaning, every sound a potential sign of danger or salvation. The cowboy finally leaned slightly forward, voice low, but still edged with the certainty of a man used to control. "Your hesitation can only last so long," he said. "The land, your family, your own future decide before it slips from reach." She inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every lesson, every memory, every expectation pressing on her. The stranger's gaze never wavered, quiet, intense, unreadable, and she realized that in this moment, every action, every word, and every glance mattered more than she had ever imagined. The night deepened, the shadows lengthened, and the tension hung thick over the plains. Her chest tightened with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew the moment of decision was approaching, but the path forward remained unclear. Each heartbeat was a drumbeat of anticipation, each glance a potential signal, and she realized that her choice might not only shape her family's fate, but redefine the rules of power and survival on this land. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying promises and warnings alike, and she understood that the conflict had only begun. The cowboy, the stranger, and the legacy of her family stood poised on the brink of confrontation, each with their own motives, each with their own power, each waiting for the spark that would ignite action. Her fingers tightened at her sides, her eyes darting between the two men. The ranch, the plains, and the shadowed hills beyond seemed to lean in, bearing witness. She drew a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the land beneath her boots, and prepared herself for the moment when the first words would finally break the silence. But the moment was not yet hers to command. The night held its secrets, the figures held their positions, and the story of loyalty, survival, and choice stretched on, unresolved, hanging over the plains like the weight of history itself. The night had settled fully over the ranch, and the air was thick with anticipation, every sound amplified in the darkness. The wind carried faint whispers through the tall grass, rustling the sagebrush as if warning of what was to come. She could feel the pulse of the land beneath her boots, steady and unyielding, matching the beat of her own heart. The cowboy's gaze never left hers, unwavering and sharp, while the stranger remained still, quiet, and impossible to read. The tension between them was tangible, an invisible line stretched taut across the corral. Her mind raced. Every choice she made from this point forward would shape not just the land and her father's future, but the life she had known and the freedom she had fought to preserve. She thought of her family, the work of generations pressed into the soil and timber of the ranch. Every fence post, every corner of the pasture, every horse and cow carried the memory of years of toil. The cowboy's ultimatum loomed like a shadow over all of it. To say yes meant safety and security, but at a price she wasn't sure she was willing to pay. To say no meant defiance, risk, and a potential loss she might never recover from. The stranger shifted slightly, finally breaking the stillness. His boots scuffed against the gravel, deliberate and controlled, drawing the cowboy's attention. The movement, though small, seemed to alter the balance of the confrontation. He raised a hand, not in aggression, but in measured caution, and spoke in a voice low and deliberate. Not all decisions are simple, and not all threats are as they appear. Sometimes the answer lies in patience, sometimes in action. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. "You've got no business meddling here," he said, though his tone betrayed a flicker of unease. He had dealt with many who underestimated him, and he had always been proven right. But this man, silent, confident, and poised, was different. The tension stretched tighter like a rope straining under weight. She took a step forward, the locket at her chest brushing against her fingers. She could feel the conflict tightening around her like a vice. The land, the family, the cowboy, the stranger, every element demanded attention. Every possibility weighed heavily. She realized she had to think quickly, to measure every nuance, every subtle movement. Hesitation could tip the balance toward disaster. The wind gusted, lifting loose dirt and dust from the dry plains. A horse whinnied in the distance, the sound sharp and urgent, a reminder that life and consequence were intertwined. Her heart thudded in her chest as she scanned the horizon. The ranch lay quiet, yet she felt the hidden presence of unseen observers, neighbors or travelers who might witness the unfolding drama and take sides. The stakes extended beyond this corral. The cowboy's ultimatum was not only for her, it carried the weight of public expectation, legal enforcement, and human pride. She glanced at the cowboy, reading the set of his jaw and the tension in his shoulders. He had lived by force and calculation for years, and he expected compliance, not hesitation. But she noticed, almost imperceptibly, the uncertainty in his eyes. He had faced defiance before, but never quite like this. The stranger's presence complicated everything, creating an unknown variable the cowboy had no immediate control over. Her pulse quickened as a thought struck her. Could she leverage this unknown factor? Could the stranger, whose motives remained mysterious, shift the balance in a way that allowed her to protect her family without surrendering herself entirely? The question brought no immediate answer, only more tension, but she felt a flicker of hope in the darkness, a possibility that the night held more than one path. The cowboy's hand hovered near the holster, subtle but enough to remind her that force was an option. He spoke again, slow and deliberate. "You can think, but not forever. Decisions don't wait. Your family, the land they are counting on you." Each word pressed down on her chest like a weight, demanding compliance, demanding action. She turned her gaze to the stranger. His stance was calm, unyielding, yet his eyes were alive with intelligence and purpose. He said nothing, letting her process, letting the cowboy grow restless, letting the moment stretch thin. She realized that he was waiting, observing, and perhaps gauging her ability to act under pressure. The quiet intensity of his presence was almost as threatening as the cowboy's ultimatum. Her thoughts flashed to her father, his lined face, calloused hands, and the pride with which he had treated the ranch as an extension of his life and legacy. She could not let him lose everything. Every instinct, every lesson passed down through generations demanded action. Yet she could not surrender herself entirely to coercion. The choice had to be hers, tempered by courage and strategy. The night grew colder, the stars faintly glinting above as if watching her deliberation. Shadows stretched across the corral, hiding and revealing details with every flicker of moonlight. She noticed small movements, the cowboy's shifting posture, the stranger's slight adjustments, and realized that every subtle cue was part of a larger equation. One wrong word, one misplaced gesture, could tip the delicate balance and bring consequences she could not control. The cowboy leaned slightly forward, his voice softening yet sharp with urgency. "The law doesn't forgive hesitation. Your father's future isn't some game. Think carefully, but think fast." She drew a slow breath, focusing on the rhythm of the land, the pulse of the earth beneath her boots. The plains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the first move. Her mind raced, weighing loyalty against independence, survival against pride, compliance against defiance. She understood now that the moment was not simply about a marriage or legal deed. It was about control, power, and the ability to influence outcomes under impossible pressure. The stranger finally spoke, quiet, precise, and deliberate. "Sometimes the path forward is hidden behind what seems like choice. Pay attention, and you may find that options are not always as limited as they appear." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Enough riddles," he said. "Time is passing. Either you decide or the law will, and I won't have to raise a hand." Her stomach twisted. The air was taut with danger and potential. She could feel the pull of the land, the weight of her father's trust, and the spark of her own independence. The night had become a test, one that measured loyalty, judgment, and courage all at once. Every instinct screamed for action, yet every lesson urged patience. She realized she could not rely solely on force, nor solely on compliance. She needed strategy, she needed insight, she needed to read every nuance of the two men standing before her. The wind shifted again, lifting the scent of sagebrush and distant smoke, carrying the faint sound of hooves or movement across the plains. The cowboy's eyes flicked to the horizon, sharp and quick, calculating any potential threats or opportunities. The stranger remained poised, still, almost statuesque, letting her absorb the tension while weighing the responses of the cowboy and the land itself. Her hands tightened at her sides. She knew that the moment of decision was approaching, and yet the climax had not arrived. The stakes were higher than ever, the land, her father's future, her own freedom, and the hidden motives of the stranger all converged in a tension that seemed about to snap. She could feel it in her chest, in the rhythm of her pulse, in the silent communication exchanged across glances, gestures, and the unspoken rules of authority and defiance. Her eyes darted between the cowboy and the stranger. The cowboy's posture was tense, every muscle prepared to enforce his will. The stranger's calm, controlled presence contrasted sharply, a reminder that influence did not always come from direct action. She realized that she held a power of her own, the ability to decide, to act, to turn hesitation into leverage. But the timing had to be perfect or risk everything unraveling. The stars above glimmered faintly, and the moonlight caught the edges of the cowboy's hat and the stranger's coat, illuminating the tension in stark relief. She could almost feel the weight of history pressing down, the legacy of her family entwined with the choices she was about to make. Every second stretched, heavy with suspense, every breath a reminder that the night could change everything in an instant. Her father's voice echoed in memory. Survival required courage, foresight, and sometimes cunning. She drew on every lesson, every story, every moment she had spent learning to read the land and the people who walked upon it. Her instincts sharpened, her awareness heightened. She knew that she would have to act, but the moment had not yet arrived. The climax of the confrontation was building, layer by layer, tension upon tension, until it could hold no more. The cowboy's voice cut through the silence again, low but forceful. "Decide, or the consequences will decide for you." His eyes bore into hers, but she felt the pull of the stranger's gaze as well. Steady, almost guiding, reminding her that the choice might be more complex than the immediate threat suggested. Her mind raced, considering every angle, every potential outcome, every hidden variable. She felt the pulse of the land, the weight of legacy, the threat of immediate loss, and the spark of autonomy fighting against obligation. She realized that the story had reached the threshold of its climax, not resolved, but poised, every element waiting for the spark that would ignite action and reveal true intentions. The night seemed to hold its breath with her. The wind stilled for a moment, the plains lay quiet, and the three figures remained frozen in the tableau of suspense. She could feel the tension stretching to its breaking point. Every heartbeat, every glance, every silent calculation had brought them here, to the edge of revelation, to the brink of decision, and yet nothing had been revealed. She knew that when the first words were spoken, the first movement made, the balance would shift, and the story would move toward its climax. But for now, she stood at the center of uncertainty, suspended between loyalty and independence, fear and courage, pressure and strategy. The night held its secrets, the land held its legacy, and the suspense hung over the plains, electric and unrelenting, waiting for the moment when the story would surge forward. And in that stillness, she drew a slow, steadying breath, feeling the weight of generations in her chest. The tension of the cowboy's ultimatum and the silent influence of the stranger. The story teetered on the edge of revelation, and every fiber of her being knew that the coming moments would demand courage, intelligence, and a measure of heart that could not be faked. The night stretched on, full of possibility, danger, and suspense, waiting for the climax that would come but not yet. The stars glimmered faintly, the wind whispered through the grass, and the land, the cowboy, the stranger, and the heiress all waited, suspended on the precipice of action, with the resolution still just out of reach, the suspense at its height, and the story on the verge of its most intense moments. The wind shifted across the plains, carrying the faint scent of smoke and dust as the tension that had gripped the corral began to loosen, just slightly, like the first release of pressure from a tightly wound spring. She took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the pulse of the land beneath her feet, steady and grounding. The cowboy's eyes never left her, sharp and unrelenting, but there was a flicker now, a question, almost respect hidden behind his hard expression. He had expected resistance, yes, but he had also expected fear, and she had shown neither. The stranger stepped closer, boots crunching lightly on the gravel, and at last spoke with calm certainty. "You do not have to surrender yourself to threats. Sometimes strength is not about yielding or defying, it is about choosing the path that protects what matters most." His eyes met hers directly, holding no judgment, only clarity. She understood instantly that he had come not to coerce, but to illuminate the options she had already possessed, options that the cowboy had overlooked. She swallowed, feeling a strange mixture of relief and determination. The land, her family, her heritage, all of it was within reach, not because of a threat, but because of her own resolve. She looked at the cowboy, who now seemed smaller in the shadow of her confidence, and spoke with the firmness that had been building within her for hours. "I will not allow my family's future to be held hostage, but neither will I surrender myself or my choices. We will find a way forward together, if you are willing to listen." The cowboy's jaw tightened, but for the first time he did not speak. He studied her, measuring the conviction in her eyes, the tone of her voice, and perhaps the hint of wisdom in her words. He had dealt with men who defied him, but women strong, unyielding, and clever were a different challenge altogether. He realized that force alone would not bend her. The solution, if it existed, required negotiation, understanding, and respect. The stranger inclined his head slightly, a gesture of affirmation. "There is more than one way to resolve this. Honor and duty do not always demand sacrifice at the expense of self. Choose wisely, and the outcome will reflect the courage you have shown tonight." She felt a wave of clarity wash over her. The stakes were still high, but the path forward had become visible. She would honor her family, protect the land, and assert her own autonomy. It would not be simple, but it was possible. The weight of the cowboy's ultimatum seemed to shift slightly, the air around him softening as he processed her words. She was no longer simply a subject to his threat. She was a participant, a negotiator, a force to be reckoned with. Her father emerged from the house then, drawn by the commotion and the flicker of movement near the corral. His face was lined with worry and fatigue, but as his eyes fell on her, a spark of pride lit within him. He saw the courage in her stance, the clarity in her gaze, and the strength that had always been there but had been tested tonight under extraordinary pressure. "You've done well," he said softly, his voice carrying through the still night. "You've held the land, the family, and yourself with honor. That is worth more than any papers or threats." The cowboy finally spoke, his voice quieter, less harsh than before. "Perhaps I misjudged you," he admitted, the faintest edge of respect threading through his words. "You have shown resolve and insight beyond what I anticipated. Maybe there is a way to resolve this without anyone losing what they value." He gestured toward the stranger. A silent acknowledgement that cooperation, not coercion, could determine the outcome. The stranger nodded subtly, and she realized that the tension that had hung over the ranch for hours was finally beginning to dissipate. The stakes had been immense, the threat real, but the courage, wisdom, and careful navigation of choices had created a bridge where conflict might have otherwise destroyed everything. The land remained, her family remained, and the balance between authority and autonomy had been preserved. Her gaze shifted across the ranch, the barns, the fields, the river winding through the valley, the horses grazing quietly now. Every corner of this land carried the legacy of her ancestors, and every lesson they had passed down guided her through this night of challenge. She felt a profound sense of connection, as though the land itself recognized her resolve and granted its silent approval. Her father stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We'll work through this together," he said. "Threats don't define us. Courage does, and you've shown plenty tonight." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of generations, a reminder that family and heritage were stronger than any coercion or fear. The cowboy finally dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a firm, deliberate sound. He approached slowly, his expression unreadable at first, but softened as he regarded her. "You've made your point clear," he said. "Strength, intelligence, loyalty. I see it now. Perhaps the law and the land can coexist with respect for choice." He held out a hand, not as a demand, but as a gesture of acknowledgement. "There's more than one way to keep the balance. I've underestimated you, and that won't happen again." She met his hand with hers, firm and steady. The tension between them, once a knife edge, now felt like a bridge difficult to cross, but navigable with understanding and respect. The cowboy's presence, once threatening, became part of the resolution, an acknowledgement that honor and force could coexist when tempered by wisdom. The stranger stepped forward, giving her a slight nod, his role in the confrontation complete. His presence had been subtle yet decisive, guiding without coercing, illuminating without imposing. She realized that his arrival had been a turning point, a reminder that outside perspective, calm observation, and measured insight could alter outcomes even in the direst circumstances. Her father's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "The land is ours, our family is intact, and you've proven yourself capable beyond measure." His pride was palpable, and she felt a deep warmth fill her chest. The fear, the pressure, and the uncertainty of the evening slowly gave way to relief, satisfaction, and the knowledge that the difficult choices had been met with courage and wisdom. The cowboy gave a final nod, a silent acknowledgement that the challenge had been met and resolved with dignity. "I'll see to it that no harm comes to your family or the land," he said. "Consider tonight a lesson in respect, yours for authority, and mine for resolve." His words carried closure, a promise that the conflict, though intense, would not leave lasting scars. She turned her gaze to the horizon, watching the first hints of dawn touch the distant hills. The plains that had held tension, fear, and anticipation now seemed serene, as if the land itself had exhaled, releasing the weight of the night. Every shadow, every blade of grass, every corner of the ranch seemed to reflect a quiet triumph, the result of courage, insight, and the refusal to surrender to threats. Her father placed a hand over hers, his grip firm and reassuring. "You've learned well," he said. "Strength and courage, tempered by wisdom and care, are what keep us alive and thriving." "Remember that," she nodded, understanding that the lessons of the night would remain with her forever, shaping her future and her relationship with the land, the people, and her own sense of self. The cowboy mounted his horse slowly, tipping his hat in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Keep your eyes sharp," your courage steady and your mind clear," he said. "The land may be safe for now, but the world is never without its trials." His warning was firm yet respectful, a final reminder of the balance between threat and choice, authority and autonomy. The stranger turned away quietly, fading into the distance, leaving her with the sense that guidance had arrived at the right moment, unseen yet deeply impactful. The quiet of the night returned, punctuated only by the rustle of the grass and the soft sound of horses breathing in the corral. She felt the tension finally drain, leaving space for reflection, relief, and the beginnings of a new day. She looked at her father, and the warmth in his eyes met hers. "We've kept the land," she said softly, "and we've kept ourselves. That is more than any threat could demand." He nodded, and together they stood at the edge of the corral, surveying the ranch that had been preserved through courage, wit, and determination. The cowboy rode off into the first light of dawn, leaving a quiet promise in his wake that honor and understanding could coexist with power and law. She felt a sense of closure and satisfaction, knowing the ultimatum had been met not through surrender, but through strategy, courage, and insight. The land, the family, and her own independence remained intact, a triumph built on wisdom and heart. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the plains, she took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the land, the weight of history, and the power of her own choices. The challenges of the night had tested her, but she had met them with resolve and integrity. Every lesson, every memory, every story her father had passed down had guided her to this moment, and she knew that this night, though tense and dangerous, had strengthened her in ways that would carry forward into all the days to come. The land stretched out before her, vast and enduring, and she felt a quiet pride in knowing that it would continue to flourish under her watch, protected by courage, intelligence, and the unyielding bond of family. The cowboy's ultimatum, the stranger's guidance, and her own careful choices had converged to create a resolution that was fair, just, and satisfying. Her father squeezed her shoulder gently. "We've weathered the storm," he said, "and together we will face whatever comes next." She smiled, a quiet, confident smile, understanding that the night had tested her, but it had not broken her. The land remained, her family remained, and the story of courage, choice, and perseverance would carry on, unbroken. The dawn light stretched over the plains, warm and steady, marking the end of a night filled with tension, fear, and challenge. The story had reached its resolution, the land and the family secure, and she had proven that courage, wisdom, and steadfastness could overcome even the most impossible threats. The ranch, the legacy, and her independence all remained intact, a testament to the strength of heart, mind, and spirit. She looked out across the fields, the river reflecting the rising sun, the barns bathed in golden light, and felt a deep, enduring sense of peace. The tension of the night was gone, replaced with clarity, resolution, and hope. The cowboy, the stranger, and the land itself had all played their parts, but it was her courage, judgment, and integrity that had ultimately carried the day. The ranch, the plains, and the future stretched out before her, limitless in possibility and rich with promise. The story of the night would remain, a lesson in loyalty, courage, and the power of careful choice. And she knew, with quiet certainty, that the land, her family, and her own freedom were safe, preserved through bravery, wisdom, and the unwavering strength of the heart. The wind whispered gently across the grass, the horses stirred quietly in the corral, and the sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the ranch. She took one last deep breath, feeling the weight of the past and the promise of the future, and smiled, knowing that tonight, every choice had mattered, and every challenge had been met. The land was theirs, the family intact, and her heart free. The story had reached its end, satisfying, complete, and full of the hope and courage that had carried her through the darkness. The plains lay calm, the air warm and golden, and she stood at the edge of the corral, a quiet sentinel over the legacy she had protected. The cowboy had ridden away, the stranger gone into the distance, and the night's tension dissolved into the promise of a new day. The ranch, her family, and her own spirit had survived, and the story ended not with fear or loss, but with courage, respect, and enduring hope. The heiress breathed deeply, letting the morning light fill her lungs, and she understood fully that she had earned the peace, security, and independence she now felt. The land, the family, and her own heart were safe, preserved through choices made with care, courage, and intelligence. She would never forget the lessons of that night, nor the power of standing firm, thinking clearly, and acting wisely. The future stretched ahead, bright and full of possibility, and she knew that no threat, no ultimatum, could ever take that away. The ranch settled into the rhythm of the morning, alive with the quiet sounds of life, work, and continuity. She turned to her father, and they shared a look filled with pride, understanding, and relief. Every challenge had been met, every danger confronted, and the resolution was complete. The story had reached its natural, satisfying conclusion, leaving the land, the family, and her own independence intact, a lasting testament to courage, wisdom, and unwavering heart. The plains, the barns, the river, and the grazing horses all stood witness to the triumph of resilience and choice. And she knew, deep in her soul, that the story of that night would echo through generations, a reminder that courage and integrity, guided by wisdom, could overcome even the most daunting of threats.